The largest conflict of the 20th century ended with tens of millions of dead, and also left thousands of stories behind. On this occasion, we will recreate many of them with the most impressive images. Our first photograph is dated February 20th, 1945, a few months before the end of the war, and shows the brutality to which the soldiers who participated were exposed. Here we see a wounded American Marine sitting on the ground and hugging his rifle while showing a piece of shrapnel that he has just removed from his neck. The event took place during the American invasion of the island of Iwo Jima between February 19th and March 26th of that year. The victory of the United States provided control of a strategic place in the Pacific for its subsequent advance on Japan. Now, if the previous image could represent the violence of war, there is no doubt that this photograph from June 7th, 1944, reflects the savage consequences of combat. The place is Normandy, France, more precisely, the beaches of Omaha. This was the scene of D-Day, the Allied landing that turned the tide of the war by initiating the recovery of French territory occupied by the Nazis. The record shows a collection point for the American funeral service. On the ground lie American and German corpses, ready for temporary burial. We continue with the invasion on the French coasts that meant the opening of a Western front in battle. This created a great problem for Hitler, since he had to divide his troops to continue fighting with the Soviet Union in the east and also withstand the attack of the Allies from the west, who sought to liberate Paris. In this image, in June 1944, you can see how German soldiers captured by the enemy carry a seriously wounded comrade on a stretcher. On May 4th, 1945, the American Army took this dramatic photograph while starving prisoners were evacuated from the recently liberated WWII concentration camp in Germany. The man carrying a comrade on his back is Luciano Allende Saez, a Spanish member of the resistance. The person who barely had the strength to hold on to him was not identified, but it is known that he was a compatriot of Saez, and despite receiving medical attention, his condition caused him to die the next day. We return to the Pacific Theater, where we find the American campaign in the Mariana Islands. As with Iwo Jima, the American initiative that began in June 1944 aimed to gain control of territories near Japan in order to serve as a base to bomb Tokyo. However, the battle to achieve occupation was brutal, and here we see how a group of United States Marines carry the body of a deceased comrade on a stretcher for burial. The Second World War began in 1939 with the invasion of Poland, but it finally broke out in May 1940 when Germany began its attack on the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, and finally France. At this stage, the Nazi self-propelled gun known as the Panzerjäger, or tank hunter, was born. Here we see it advancing cautiously along a French road, accompanied by infantry on foot. In a similar scene, on May 16, 1940, soldiers from the French Air Reconnaissance Group patrol a territory near the town of Braine-le-Comte, Belgium. Behind them, a German plane carrying 2 soldiers can be seen when it was hit by anti-aircraft fire and crashed. During the explosion, one of the crew members was seriously injured and died the next day. The other, with minor injuries, tried to flee but was intercepted by Allied fighters, who shot him and also ended up dead. Those weeks were full of confrontations where the Nazis achieved a clear advantage, occupying several countries and crushing enemy forces. However, this image symbolizes a small Allied victory in the harsh conflict. It belongs to the coasts of Dunkirk, France, where soldiers were rescued and taken to England after being cornered by the Germans. Under the name Operation Dynamo, more than 300,000 men were evacuated between May 26 and June 4, 1940. In this image from July 1940, we can see the moment when several soldiers line up to receive decorations from the high command of the army. They are Iron Crosses of the second class and Crosses of Merit. The German government issued a variety of awards for both military and civilians, so they could be awarded to the entire population. In this case, the medals had different levels of importance, with the two mentioned being the lowest and most widely awarded. On the other hand, the Grand Iron Cross was the highest possible distinction and was awarded to a single person, the Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring. Not satisfied with the great victory over a power like France, Nazi Germany intended to continue expanding its conquests on the other side of the English Channel and achieve the occupation of the United Kingdom. In September 1940, the so-called Blitz began, the name given to a sustained bombing campaign against the British nation. This image shows the city of Manchester in flames after the attacks on December 22nd and 23rd of that year. Firefighters try to put out the intense fire after receiving 460 tons of high explosive bombs and almost 2,000 incendiary projectiles that destroyed thousands of homes. Days later, another postcard travels around the world. In this case with the striking photograph of December 29, 1940, showing St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Despite Nazi power, the Royal Air Force was eventually able to counter the attacks and resist, preventing enemy occupation. However, the failed attempt to invade British territory did not discourage Adolf Hitler. On the contrary, on June 22, 1941, one of the most daring missions began, Operation Barbarossa. This was the Führer's plan to occupy the Soviet Union, a country he betrayed after a non-aggression pact. In this photograph from early July of that year, we see Nazi armored personnel carriers moving through a burning Russian village. The soldiers are crouched and ready to spread terror among the population. Despite having gained ground by taking the Red Army by surprise, the battle against them was one of the turning points for the Germans. The resistance of the Soviets became a problem for the Nazi forces, who constantly lost men without achieving full control of the territory. In that sense, the Battle of Stalingrad marked a before and after, marking the beginning of the debacle of the Third Reich. In this image, we see the 24th Panzer Division during the fighting for the southern station of the city on September 15, 1942. This photograph was taken during the same month, showing a crew of Soviet forces operating a Maxim M1910 machine gun on the Voronezh front in Russia. Most of the city had been captured by the Germans, but the new offensive by Stalin's men took advantage of a weakened Wehrmacht to regain ground. The communists are beginning to tip the balance in their favor, and the Führer feels the pressure of not having the dominance of the early years of the war. It is the last days of December 1943, and the Pacific Theater pits the United States Marines against the Imperial troops of Japan. After a hard-fought victory at the Battle of Cape Gloucester, these wounded Americans are trying to enjoy their meal. The battle took place over the island of New Britain, a territory of New Guinea, between December 26, 1943, and January 16, 1944. And brought the Allies closer to their goal of destroying Tokyo, one of the Axis powers. This image from February 23, 1944, shows the burning wreckage of a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress of the U.S. 379 Thief Bombardment Group. This aircraft had unusually heavy defensive armament, with up to 13 machine guns depending on the model, and was the aircraft that dropped the most bombs during World War II. It was widely used by the Allies, but this example was lost when it caught fire while undergoing maintenance by ground crew. The Allied forces were supported by armies from several nations, and a clear example of the breadth of the coalition is this image, where the 6th New Zealand Regiment is firing a cannon at night from its position in a vineyard near Sora, Italy. The photograph is from June 1, 1944. The campaign on Italian soil to eradicate Mussolini's fascism was the largest contribution of the Oceanian country in the war. More than 2,100 New Zealanders died, and 6,700 were wounded. This particular photograph is from June 4, 1944. It is a German submarine U-505 that has just been captured off the coast of Rio de Oro in West Africa by an American aircraft carrier task force that immediately placed its flag on it. The 58 Nazi crew members were taken prisoner, and the ship was towed to Port Royal Bay. This event represented the first capture of an enemy ship by the American Navy since the War of 1812. We find ourselves back on the beaches of Omaha during the Normandy landings on June 16, 1944. In this new scene, we see how a captain and doctors attend to a wounded soldier of the 1st Infantry Division of the United States in the area of Fox Green opposite Colville. They are giving him a plasma transfusion, and he is wrapped in a military blanket to avoid hypothermia, while his head is supported by an inflatable life jacket. On the other side of the world, fierce fighting continues between Americans and Japanese. This image from June 13, 1944, shows a Tokyo kamikaze plane shot down when it tried to attack a group of aircraft carriers near the Mariana Islands in the Pacific. At the head of these aircraft were pilots carrying a large quantity of explosives. Their aim was to crash into their enemies, and they did not mind dying as long as they caused great damage to the enemy. After landing on the French coast, Allied troops began their advance towards Paris to liberate the nation from German occupation. In this image, from July 8, 1944, U.S. soldiers can be seen hurrying their pace during an attack on the Boulaville Road, northwest of La Haye-du-Puy. Recapturing that region was a challenge due to strong Nazi resistance. However, the rival forces managed to penetrate the defensive positions and defeat Hitler's men. It is December 5, 1944, and the fighting continues in France. The picture shows the U.S. 398th Infantry Regiment as it advances through the Rosteg area. One American soldier keeps firing at his opponent, while 2 of his comrades reload their rifles. The fierce fighting does not stop on the road to the liberation of Paris. On December 16, 1944, Operation Greif was launched as part of the last German offensive of the war. Under the command of Otto Skorzeny, a unit of around 80 Nazi soldiers in American uniforms who had stolen their prisoners advanced along the front in the Ardennes. They all spoke perfect English, and their goal was to go unnoticed in order to reach the Allied headquarters at Versailles, where they would assassinate Commander Dwight Eisenhower. However, the mission failed. They were discovered and ended up in front of a firing squad as shown in the picture, punished by death. This photograph from December 18, 1944, takes us to another scene where the war continued its course. This is Greece, which had been occupied by the Germans after a failed attempt by Mussolini's Italy. When the Nazi troops left the place, a civil war broke out between 2 local factions that wanted to take control of the country. One of those sides was communist, and here we can see part of the British expedition, which advances to prevent them from achieving victory and power. The war continued and added constant victories for the Allies. In this image from December 19, 1944, we see 6 members of the American 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. The company poses in front of an M10 armored vehicle. These men were credited with having shot down 4 Panzer VI King Tigers in Belgium, the most powerful tank of the Nazis. Towards the end of 1944, Allied supremacy was felt in these types of duels, and this photograph is an example of this. It shows a huge depot of captured or destroyed German armored vehicles and equipment in the vicinity of Normandy. What had been one of the backbones of Nazi power reduced to pure scrap metal. January 1945. With his skin burned by snow and stained by gunpowder, this American soldier removes an improvised cover from the muzzle of his rifle. He is in the Battle of the Bulge, which is beginning to generate feelings that the end is near. The last year of the war has begun. On the morning of January 1st, 1945, the young German pilot Alfred Michel has just begun and abruptly ended his participation in the conflict. He had taken off for his first mission, and it also turned out to be the last offensive operation of the conflict for the Luftwaffe. The objective was to attack 16 Allied airfields and destroy as many planes as possible. To do so, the Nazis had to survive anti-aircraft fire, something not many managed. Here you can see Michel with a slight wound and his aircraft devastated. Red Army soldiers opened the gates of Auschwitz, the German extermination camp in occupied Poland. It is January 27, 1945, and this action put an end to the slaughter inside the complex, best remembered for its enormous cruelty. More than 1 million prisoners died there, mainly Jews. This incredible image is from February 14, 1945, and shows an F-4U Corsair plane aboard the USS Bennington after it crashed into the turret of the American ship. The incident occurred while it was taking part in the fighting in the Pacific. It can be seen as it ends up broken in half and burning. This photograph from February 19, 1945 shows U.S. Marines attacking Japanese positions near the Suribachi base on Iwo Jima. The explosion in the background is watched intently by the soldier. Despite the difficulties, the Americans managed to annihilate all the enemy forces after a month of combat. A day later, on February 20th, Navy doctors, paramedics, and a chaplain tend to the wounded at a first aid station on the same Japanese island. One of the men has serious burns from enemy artillery. They are given transfusions to keep them alive after the brutality of war. Back in the European theater, Germany's defensive lines are beginning to fall. This image from 24 February 1945 shows American tanks moving through the ruins left by the fighting in the town of Linnich. The end is drawing ever closer. Nazi prisoners and their American guard take cover behind an M10 tank destroyer from an attack by German self-propelled guns. The men were captured by American infantrymen in the Prum Valley on February 28, 1945. In the Pacific, the Allied incursion is also accelerating. Here we see American Marines aiming their rifles at the entrance to a cave after launching an explosive charge to drive out Japanese troops hiding in Okinawa. The attack on this island, located 600 kilometers from Japan, was a moral blow to Tokyo. However, the American victory between April 1st and June 21st, 1945, had a brutal balance of more than 125,000 dead on both sides. A U.S. Army M4 Sherman tank protects American soldiers from the 763rd Battalion from a terrible explosion that takes place during April 1945 in the bloody battle in Okinawa. The column of smoke rises into the sky, and the soldiers are grateful to live another day. The fierce fighting on this Japanese island continues to leave postcards, such as this one from May 1945, where U.S. Marines fight for control of a hill near Naha. The unit is surrounded by enemy fire, but remains firm in its task of firing at rival positions. One soldier can be seen aiming at the enemy, while another comrade reloads his weapon. The end comes, where troops from the 25th Infantry Division burn a Japanese post in Baguio, Philippines. A violent battle broke out here between February 21st and April 26, 1945, and was part of the campaign for the liberation of the Asian country by the Allies. Now, This same scene becomes the field where the surrender of Tokyo's forces takes place in September. The last enemy raises the white flag, and the conflict ends.
Representative of the Emperor of Japan, the Japanese government, and the Japanese Imperial General.
Thus, after 6 years and millions of deaths, the most brutal conflict of the last century comes to an end. We hope you enjoyed this tour of World War II, and we look forward to seeing you in our next military history video.